Some choices don't save lives, they reveal what a life is worth. The wind dragged its frozen teeth across the wasteland as Sergeant Ethan Cole pushed forward, each step crunching against a surface that looked like snow but felt like shattered glass beneath his boots, his breath fogging the inside of his visor, while warning indicators blinked low amber across his display. Oxygen stable, power at 14%, navigation offline. Just enough to keep moving and not enough to matter if he stopped. The battlefield had gone quiet in that unnatural way that followed chaos. No voices, no signals, just the distant hum of something mechanical still searching, still scanning. And Ethan knew better than to trust silence out here, especially on a world that didn't belong to him. He adjusted the grip on his rifle, not aiming, just holding it like a habit he couldn't shake, when something flickered at the edge of his vision. A faint, uneven glow buried beneath a drift of pale dust about 30 yards ahead. He froze, every instinct telling him to ignore it, to keep walking, to survive. But instinct had never been the thing that defined him. He moved closer, slow, careful, boots sinking an inch with every step until the shape came into view. A figure, slender, unmoving, skin unlike anything human. A soft blue luminescence dimmed almost to nothing, like the last pulse of a dying ember. She was partially buried, one arm exposed, fingers curled weakly against the cold surface. And beneath her chest something pulsed, not bright, not steady, but alive, like a heartbeat made of light. Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound loud inside his helmet as he crouched down, scanning for threats, for traps, for anything that would justify leaving. But there was nothing, just her, fragile in a way the rest of this world wasn't. Her eyes opened suddenly, sharp despite the exhaustion, locking onto him with a mix of defiance and something deeper, something closer to resignation. Don't. Her voice cracked through the translator, thin and uneven. Come closer. Human. Ethan didn't raise his weapon, didn't step back either, just studied her for a second that stretched longer than it should have, taking in the trembling in her limbs, the shallow rise of her breathing, the way that light in her chest faltered like it was struggling to stay. He reached up instead, unclipping the outer layer of his thermal jacket as the temperature warning spiked immediately against his suit, cold biting through the fabric beneath, and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the contact, confusion flashing across her face as much as pain, her gaze searching his like she was trying to solve something that didn't make sense. Why? She whispered, barely audible now. Why would you? Ethan shook his head once, simple, almost tired, as if the answer wasn't worth explaining, because maybe it wasn't. Somewhere above them, faint but growing louder, the distant hum sharpened into something more precise, more focused, and his HUD flickered as a signal tried to break through static, a voice forcing its way into his ear, urgent, controlled, unmistakably human. Sergeant Cole, if you can hear this, confirm visual on the target. That organism is not civilian. It is a trigger. Repeat, it is a trigger. If it dies, it sends a signal. And if that signal is sent, the voice paused, just long enough to feel heavier than the cold pressing in around him. Earth doesn't get a second chance. Ethan didn't respond right away, his eyes still on hers as the wind shifted, carrying that mechanical hum closer. And for a moment, the only thing that mattered wasn't the war, or the signal, or the world waiting far beyond this frozen place. It was the simple, undeniable fact that she was still breathing, and he hadn't walked away yet. If saving a life could end a world, would you still do it? The question lingered in the static between Ethan Cole's heartbeat and the voice still echoing in his ear as the wind pressed harder against his suit, carrying that distant mechanical hum closer with every passing second, while the alien woman beneath his jacket trembled not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something wired into the faint pulse of light beneath her chest. Ethan's fingers hovered near his rifle, not lifting it, not lowering it either, just resting in that fragile space where decisions began. Before they were made, as his visor flickered again with broken telemetry, the signal struggling to stay intact. Sergeant, confirm compliance. The voice returned, sharper now, less patient, as if distance itself was running out of time. You are authorized to neutralize the target immediately. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching her eyes instead of the data scrolling across his display, Because the numbers were easy. The orders were clear, but her expression was not. It was searching, uncertain, like she was trying to understand a species that had been described to her only in warnings and outcomes. "You hear them," she said quietly, her voice steadier than before, but still fragile at the edges. "Your kind always listens to commands, always calculates the greater survival outcome." Ethan gave a faint shake of his head, almost more to himself than to her, as he adjusted the jacket around her shoulders, sealing in what little warmth he could spare while the cold began to bite deeper through his undersuit. "Not always," he replied, his voice calm, grounded, the kind that did not need to be loud to carry weight. Her gaze narrowed slightly, not in hostility, but in confusion, like something in her understanding had just cracked open, and for a moment neither of them spoke as the wind shifted again and the hum above sharpened into distinct layers, scanning pulses sweeping across the terrain in measured intervals. Ethan's HUD lit up with warning arcs, incoming search pattern. Closing fast, an instinct finally pushed him to move as he glanced toward the jagged outline of a collapsed structure barely visible through the haze about 40 yards out. "Can you stand?" he asked, already knowing the answer before she tried, her body tensing as she pushed against the frozen ground only to falter as the light in her chest dimmed sharply, flickering like a signal struggling to hold form. Ethan did not hesitate, lowering his rifle to his side and reaching down, lifting her carefully despite the added strain on his already failing systems, the servos in his suit whining softly as they compensated for the extra weight. She stiffened at first, clearly unused to the contact, but did not resist, her hand instinctively gripping the front of his suit as if anchoring herself to something solid in a world that was anything but. "You risk your survival probability," she murmured, her head resting lightly against his shoulder as he moved. Each step measured, deliberate, the cold crunch beneath his boots echoing louder now in the tightening silence between scans. Ethan kept his eyes forward, tracking the rhythm of the drones above, timing his movement between their sweeps. "Yeah," he said simply, "story of my life." They reached the edge of the structure just as a scanning wave passed overhead, the light brushing across the surface of the terrain but missing them by seconds, and Ethan slipped inside the broken shell of what once might have been a research outpost, its interior shielded just enough to buy them time. He lowered her gently against the wall, the dim interior casting soft shadows across her face as that faint glow in her chest steadied again, responding not to medicine, not to technology, but to something far less measurable. Outside, the hum continued, searching, patient, and Ethan leaned back against the cold metal beside her, his rifle resting within reach but untouched as the voice in his ear fell silent for the first time since the order had been given. In that quiet, broken only by the slow rhythm of two different breaths sharing the same space, she looked at him again, not with fear this time, not even with distrust, but with a question that seemed far older than either of them. "If I am what they say," she asked softly, "why are you still here?" Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, feeling the cold, the weight, the choice pressing in from every direction, and when he opened them again, there was no hesitation left, only something steady, something human. "Because you did not ask me to save your world," he said, his voice low, certain. "You just asked me not to walk away. Sometimes the universe does not test your strength, it tests what you refuse to become." The air inside the broken structure carried a different kind of cold, not the biting wind from outside, but something still, almost watchful, as if the walls themselves remembered what they used to protect. While Ethan Cole sat with his back against the metal, his breath steady but shallow, every system in his suit quietly counting down in numbers he chose not to look at, while across from him the alien woman watched in silence, her luminous skin dim but stable now, the pulse beneath her chest no longer erratic, but not at peace either. The hum outside shifted again, closer this time, slower, more deliberate, and Ethan could feel it through the floor, a vibration. That was not sound but intention, something searching not just for movement but for presence. "They are narrowing the scan," she said softly, her voice clearer now, less fragile, as if whatever strength she had left was returning piece by piece. "They will find us within minutes." Ethan nodded once, already calculating angles in his head, not escape, just delay, because delay was the only currency he had left to spend. Then we move before they finish thinking, he replied, pushing himself up. As the servos in his suit responded with a faint resistance, a reminder that even metal had limits, she studied him again, that same quiet confusion lingering beneath her composure. You continue to act against probability, she said, almost to herself. Your survival decreases with every decision you make. Ethan allowed a faint breath of something that might have been a laugh, though it carried no humor, only recognition. Yeah, well, survival is not always the point. For a moment, she said. Nothing, her gaze shifting down to her own hands, pale blue against the dull gray of the structure, fingers flexing slowly as if reconnecting to a body that had almost left her behind. In my world, she began carefully, value is measured by function, by outcome, by what ensures continuation of the collective. Individuals are variables, nothing more. Ethan stepped closer, extending a hand without urgency, not demanding, just offering. And here, he asked quietly. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the faint light from her chest, something changing behind them in a way that was not sudden but undeniable. Here. I do not understand the equation. Ethan gave a small nod, as if that answer made more sense than any explanation ever could. And when she took his hand this time, it was not out of necessity, it was a choice. Outside, the scanning wave intensified, brushing against the structure like a silent tide, and Ethan moved quickly, guiding her toward a narrow exit on the far side where the wall had partially collapsed, revealing a path that led deeper into the fractured terrain. We stay low, we move when the pulse fades, and we do not give them a pattern, he said, his voice steady, grounding, as if saying it out loud made it real enough to follow. She nodded, absorbing not just the words but the intent behind them, and together they stepped out into the shifting cold once more, the wind catching the edges of his suit and her borrowed jacket as the sky above flickered faintly with distant movement. They moved in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because every step mattered more than words now. Their rhythm, uneven at first, then slowly aligning. Human and alien finding a pace that neither had known before. After several yards, she spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if the question had been forming long before she found the courage to ask it. If they are correct, if my existence threatens your entire world, would you still protect me? Ethan did not stop walking, did not even hesitate. His gaze fixed ahead as the terrain opened into a wider expanse broken by scattered formations that could offer brief cover if timed right. I am not protecting a threat, he said, his voice low but certain. I am protecting someone who is still breathing. She slowed slightly at that, the words settling into something deeper than understanding, something closer to feeling. And the light beneath her chest responded, not brighter, not louder, but steadier, like it had found a reason to continue. Above them, the hum shifted again, sharper now, closer than before, and Ethan knew the window was closing faster than either of them wanted to admit. But for the first time since the signal had come through, the weight of the choice did not feel like a burden, it felt like direction. The moment you stop seeing someone as a threat, you start seeing what they could become. The terrain opened wider as Ethan guided her across the fractured expanse, the ground uneven beneath their feet, patches of frozen dust shifting like ash with every step, while the sky above pulsed faintly with distant movement, the search pattern tightening into something more deliberate, more focused, and Ethan could feel it now not just through his suit, but through instinct. That quiet pressure at the back of his mind that told him they were no longer just being scanned, they were being anticipated. The wind had softened, but the silence it left behind felt heavier, broken only by the low rhythm of their movement and the faint, steady glow from her chest that seemed to cast a subtle reflection against the metallic edges of his armor. They are adapting, she said, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of realization. They are learning your pattern, predicting your path. Ethan adjusted his direction slightly, angling toward a cluster of jagged formations rising about 60 feet. Ahead, their sharp silhouettes offering brief shadows against the open ground. Then we stopped giving them one, he replied, slowing just enough to shift their pace into something irregular, steps uneven, pauses unpredictable, the kind of movement no machine could easily map. She watched him do it, Not just following but studying, her breathing steady now, her balance stronger, as if each moment beside him was rewriting something fundamental inside her. You act without optimizing, she observed. Quietly, you choose uncertainty over efficiency. Ethan gave a faint nod, eyes scanning the horizon as another pulse of light swept across the terrain behind them, missing by seconds again. Uncertainty keeps you alive longer than certainty ever will, he said, his tone simple, not defensive, just true. They reached the first formation and slipped into its shadow, the temperature dropping slightly as the wind lost its direct path. And Ethan motioned for her to stay low as he crouched near the edge, watching the timing of the scans, counting in his head, measuring distance without needing numbers. There is something you are not asking, she said after a moment, her voice softer now, more grounded. About me, about what I am. Ethan did not turn immediately, his focus still on the shifting light beyond the rocks. I was told what you are, he answered. That is not the same thing. She absorbed that, her gaze lowering briefly as the glow beneath her chest pulsed once, brighter than before, then settled again, and when she spoke next there was something different in her tone, not just honesty, but weight. The signal within me, it is not a weapon by design, she said, choosing each word carefully. It is a failsafe, created by my people long before your kind entered this system. Ethan finally looked back at her, not alarmed, not surprised, just listening, the way he had from the beginning. Failsafe for what? He asked. She met his eyes, and for the first time there was no hesitation, no guarded distance, only clarity. For judgment, she said. If a species encounters me and chooses elimination over understanding, the signal activates, and their world is marked for removal. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint resonance from above, and Ethan let out a slow breath, processing not just the information but the implication behind it. So if I had followed orders, he began, your world would already be ending. She finished quietly. Neither of them spoke for a moment after that, the silence stretching not from uncertainty, but from the weight of something that had almost happened without either of them fully understanding it. Ethan turned back toward the open ground, eyes narrowing slightly as the scanning pattern adjusted again, more aggressive now, more precise, as if something out there had begun to question its own assumptions. Good thing I am not great at following orders, he said, the hint of something lighter threading through his voice despite everything pressing in around them. She studied him again, but this time there was no confusion, no attempt to calculate, only something new, something that had not existed when they first met in the frozen dust. Your kind is not inefficient, she said slowly. You are unpredictable in a way that cannot be measured. Ethan allowed a faint breath of agreement, shifting his weight as he prepared to move again. We call that being human, he replied, extending his hand once more as the next scan faded just enough to create an opening. She took it without hesitation this time, rising with him as they stepped back into the uncertain light together. The path ahead still dangerous, still unknown, but no longer defined by fear of what she was, only by what they were choosing to protect. The universe does not destroy what it fears, it erases what it cannot understand. The wind shifted again as Ethan stepped out from the shadow of the jagged formation, his grip steady around her hand while the terrain ahead stretched into a fractured valley of broken ridges and shallow depressions, each one offering moments of concealment if timed right. And above them the scanning pattern had changed, no longer sweeping in wide arcs, but tightening into focused pulses that lingered longer in each zone, as if something out there had begun to doubt its own conclusions. Ethan slowed, studying the rhythm, the intervals between light and silence, his mind mapping not escape, but possibility. Because escape was no longer the objective, not after what she had told him. Beside him, she moved with more certainty now, her steps stronger, her balance returning, and the glow beneath her chest held steady like a quiet heartbeat that refused to fade. They are no longer searching randomly, she said, her voice calm but precise. They are confirming a hypothesis. Ethan nodded, slightly, eyes forward. Yeah, that we are still alive. The next pulse swept closer, brushing the edge of the ridge behind them, and Ethan pulled her down into a shallow dip in the ground, both of them lowering instinctively as the light passed overhead, close enough that his visor flickered with interference. When it faded, he exhaled slowly, then glanced at her. "How far does your signal reach?" She hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of the answer. "Far enough," she said, quietly, "that if it activates, distance will not matter." Ethan absorbed that without reaction, not because it was not serious, but because reacting would not change it, and for a moment he looked out across the valley, the fractured land stretching toward a distant structure half buried in the terrain, its outline barely visible through the haze. "That building," he said, nodding toward it. "You recognize it?" Her eyes followed his gaze, narrowing slightly as something familiar registered. "Yes, it is one of the early relay stations, abandoned when the war expanded beyond this region." Ethan allowed himself a small breath of relief. Then it might still have shielding, something to block that signal long enough for us to think. She turned back to him, studying his face, not for doubt this time, but for intention. "You still intend to preserve me?" she said, not as a question, but as an observation. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I intend to give us a chance." For a second, something shifted in her expression, not confusion, not calculation, but something quieter, something that did not need to be named. The wind rose again, carrying a sharper hum from above, closer than before, and Ethan knew the margin was closing. "We move fast, we stay unpredictable, and we do not stop," he said, already rising, pulling her with him as they broke from cover and moved across the open stretch toward the distant structure. The ground here was less stable, fragments shifting underfoot, forcing them to adjust constantly. Their pace uneven but forward, always forward, while the sky above pulsed again. The scan sweeping faster now, almost urgent. "Why does your kind resist?" "Certainty," she asked as they moved, her voice steady despite the strain. "Why choose a path that increases risk when a safer option exists?" Ethan did not slow, his focus locked on the structure ahead, its outline growing clearer with every step. "Because safe does not always mean right," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty that had followed him since the moment he chose not to walk away. She absorbed that in silence, her gaze shifting briefly to the ground, then back to him. And the light within her chest responded again, not brighter, not stronger, but more stable, as if something inside her had aligned with something inside him. The next scan hit closer, catching the edge of their movement, and for a fraction of a second the air itself seemed to tighten, the hum above sharpening into focus. Ethan felt it, the awareness, the moment where they were no longer just moving through the world but being observed within it, and he did not hesitate, adjusting course slightly, breaking the pattern just enough to slip past the center of the scan as it swept behind them. The structure loomed closer now, its broken exterior casting long shadows across the valley floor, and as they reached its edge, Ethan guided her inside through a narrow breach in the wall. The interior darker, quieter, the air still carrying the faint remnants of something that once functioned with purpose. He leaned back against the cold metal for a brief second, catching his breath as the hum outside continued, searching, recalculating, and for the first time since this began, the silence between them felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but grounded in something neither of them had expected to find. She looked at him again, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "If your kind had encountered me without you, the outcome would have been different." Ethan gave a faint nod, not in pride, not in regret, just acknowledgement. "Yeah, probably." She studied him for a moment longer, then asked the question that had been building since the beginning. "Then why are you different?" Ethan let out a slow breath, the answer forming not from logic, not from orders, but from something far simpler. "I am not," he said quietly. "I just did not forget what matters. A machine looks for patterns, a human decides when to break them." The interior of the abandoned relay station held a different kind of silence, one that felt layered with memory rather than emptiness. Faint metallic walls stretching upward in fractured angles, while dormant panels flickered weakly as if reacting to their presence. And Ethan Cole moved carefully through the dim corridor, each step echoing just enough to remind him how exposed sound could be in a place like this. The cold here was less aggressive, muted by whatever shielding still remained, but his suit continued its quiet warnings, power slipping lower, systems compensating more slowly. And he knew time was no longer just a factor, it was a limit. Behind him, she followed with steadier footing now, her breathing even, the glow beneath her chest reflecting faintly against the walls as though the station itself recognized the signal she carried. This structure was designed to relay long-distance transmissions, she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet certainty as her gaze moved across the faded interfaces. If any part of it still functions, it could interfere with external scans, possibly distort them. Ethan glanced back briefly, a small acknowledgement in his expression. Distortion is good. I will take anything that buys us a few more minutes. They reached a central chamber where the ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving a narrow opening that allowed pale light to filter in from above, dust drifting slowly through the air like suspended ash. And in the center stood a fractured console, its surface cracked but not entirely dead. Faint pulses of energy flickering beneath the damage. Ethan approached it, brushing away debris with a gloved hand as the panel responded with a weak hum. Not fully active, but not gone either. You know how to use it? He asked, stepping slightly aside to give her space. She hesitated only a moment before moving closer, her fingers hovering over the surface as if remembering something not just learned, but inherent. Not in the way your systems operate, she said. But this technology shares a common origin with my people. I may be able to access a basic function. Ethan nodded once, then shifted his attention toward the broken entrance, keeping watch as she worked, his rifle still at his side, and used, but ready if needed, though he was no longer sure what needed meant in a situation like this. Her hands moved slowly at first, then with growing precision as faint symbols flickered across the console, responding to her touch. The glow in her chest sinking subtly with the system, as if bridging a connection that had never fully been lost. It is responding, she said, a note of quiet surprise in her voice. But the power is unstable. I can create interference, but only for a short duration. Ethan exhaled. That was all he needed. Short works. Outside, the hum shifted again, closer than ever now. The scanning pulses sharper, almost pressing against the structure itself, and Ethan could feel the tension rise not as fear, but as awareness, the kind that sharpened every sense and stripped everything else away. How long? He asked. She paused, calculating not in numbers, but in instinct. Perhaps 3 minutes, no more. Ethan gave a small nod, already adjusting his plan around that limitation, because limitation was something he understood. Then we make those 3 minutes count. She looked up at him then, really looked, not as a variable, not as a risk, but as something she had not encountered before, something that did not fit within the framework she had been taught. You continue to move forward without guarantee, she said quietly, without certainty of success or survival. Ethan allowed a faint breath, something softer than before, something closer to truth than defiance. Yeah, that is kind of our thing. Her gaze lingered a moment longer. Then she turned back to the console, committing to the action fully now as the system responded with a deeper resonance, the faint hum growing stronger, spreading outward through the structure like a ripple. The light above flickered, the air itself shifting as the interference began to build, subtle at first, then more pronounced, distorting the rhythm of the scans outside. Ethan stepped closer to the entrance, watching as the next pulse swept across the terrain and bent slightly at the edges, its precision faltering just enough to create an opening. That is it, he said, his voice low but certain. That is our window. She nodded, maintaining focus, the glow in her chest steady and aligned with the console's output. And for a moment the station felt alive again, not as it once was, but as something new, something redefined by the presence of two beings who should never have stood here together. Ethan, she said suddenly, her voice carrying something more than information now, something closer to urgency. If the interference fails, if the signal within me activates. She did not finish the sentence, did not need to. Ethan turned slightly, meeting her gaze without hesitation, the answer already there before the question could fully form. Then we deal with it when it happens, he said, simple, grounded, unshaken. She held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded, not because she fully understood, but because she trusted what she saw. Outside, the distorted scan passed again, weaker now, uncertain, And Ethan tightened his grip slightly, not on his weapon, but on the moment itself. Because moments like this did not last, they had to be used. 3 minutes, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Let us not waste them. 3 minutes is not time. It is a decision waiting to happen. The hum inside the relay station deepened as the interference spread outward, bending the rhythm of the scanning pulses into something uneven, something uncertain, and Ethan Cole stood at the fractured entrance watching the distortion ripple across the landscape like heat over steel, while the sky above flickered with hesitation for the first time since the hunt began. Behind him, the console pulsed in sync with the faint glow from her chest. The connection between her and the station no longer. Fragile but deliberate, as if two separate systems had recognized the same purpose and chosen to align. The distortion is holding, she said, her voice steady but strained at the edges. But the system is drawing more energy than expected. Ethan did not turn, his eyes tracking the shifting pattern outside, noting how the scans began to overlap, correcting themselves, adapting again. They are adjusting, he said quietly. They always do. He stepped forward slightly, measuring distance from the entrance to the nearest cover beyond the structure. About 45 yards of open ground broken only by shallow ridges that would not hide them if the scan stabilized. We will not outrun them, she added, not as fear but as fact, her hand still on the console as the light beneath her chest flickered once, then steadied again. Ethan nodded once, because he already knew that, and knowing it did not change what came next. We do not need to outrun them, he said, his voice calm, almost grounded in something that did not depend on outcome. We just need to stay unpredictable long enough to reach the next move. She glanced toward him, something thoughtful in her expression, something that had grown stronger with every moment they shared. Your strategy relies on variables you cannot control, she said, not questioning, just observing. Ethan allowed a faint breath that might have been a smile if the moment had been lighter. Yeah, that is kind of the point. The console pulsed again, stronger now, and the distortion outside intensified, the scanning wave bending further at its edges, its precision faltering just enough to create fractures in its coverage. Ethan saw it immediately, the gap forming like a miscalculation in something that had never expected resistance from uncertainty. That is our exit, he said, stepping back from the entrance and turning toward her, his posture shifting from observation to action. She hesitated for the first time since the interference began, not from doubt but from awareness. If I disconnect, the distortion will collapse, she said. They will regain full scan within seconds. Ethan met her gaze, steady, unshaken. Then we use those seconds. She studied him, not for logic now, not for probability, but for something else, something she had not known how to measure before this moment. And whatever she saw there answered the question she had not spoken. Her hands lifted slowly from the console, the connection, breaking with a soft drop in resonance as the station's hum weakened instantly. Outside, the distortion began to fade, the scanning pattern sharpening again, correcting itself. Now, Ethan said, and they moved together without hesitation, stepping out into the open as the fading interference created a narrow window between pulses. The cold hit harder outside, sharper, more immediate. But neither of them slowed as they crossed the first stretch of ground, their steps uneven, deliberately, irregular, breaking rhythm, denying pattern. Behind them, the station's light dimmed, its brief resurgence already collapsing into silence, while above them the scans surged back to full strength, sweeping faster, searching harder. Ethan, she said as they moved, her voice carrying something new beneath its calm surface, something closer to urgency than before. If we are seen now. He did not look back, his focus fixed ahead where the terrain dipped into a deeper ravine that could offer momentary concealment. Then we deal with it when it happens, he repeated, the same answer, the same certainty, because it had not changed. She fell silent after that, but not because she lacked words, because she was beginning to understand them. The next scan passed just behind them, close enough that the air itself seemed to tighten again, and for a fraction of a second the world narrowed to movement and breath and the quiet decision to keep going. They reached the edge of the ravine as the pulse faded, slipping down into its shadow just as the light swept across the surface above, missing them by less than a second. Ethan paused there, just for a moment, catching his breath as his suit flickered another. Warning, power dropping into critical range, systems beginning to limit function. He ignored it, because some limits did not matter when the choice had already been made. Beside him, she steadied herself against the rock, the glow in her chest still present, still aligned, and she looked at him again, not as something she needed to understand, but as something she had chosen to trust. "You are running out of time," she said quietly. Ethan gave a small nod, not denying it, not fearing it, just accepting it as part of the path he had already taken. "Yeah," he said, his voice calm despite everything closing in around them. "But so are they. When there is nowhere left to run, what you choose becomes who you are." The ravine swallowed the wind, replacing it with a stillness that felt almost unnatural as Ethan Cole steadied himself against the cold rock, his suit dimming further, power indicators blinking in slow, fading intervals while the distant hum above sharpened into something more precise, more certain, as if whatever hunted them had finally decided uncertainty was no longer acceptable. The next scan passed overhead, tighter than before, brushing the edges of the ravine with a faint distortion that no longer wavered, no longer hesitated, and Ethan knew the window they had created was closing faster than anything he could outrun. Beside him, she remained quiet for a moment, her breathing even, her posture no longer fragile but grounded, the glow beneath her chest steady in a way it had not been before, as if something within her had reached a point of alignment that did not depend on survival anymore. "They are converging," she said finally, her voice calm, not alarmed, just certain. "This path leads to containment, not escape." Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze lifting toward the narrow strip of sky above the ravine, watching the faint shifts in light as the scanning pattern overlapped, sealing gaps, removing unpredictability piece by piece. "Yeah," he said quietly. "They are done guessing." He pushed himself upright despite the strain in his suit, the movement slower now, heavier, but deliberate as always, because slowing down did not mean stopping. "Not yet." She watched him for a second longer, then stepped closer, her presence no longer something he was guiding but something that moved with him, choosing the same direction without needing instruction. "There is something I have not told you," she said, her tone softer now, not from weakness but from the weight of what remained unsaid. Ethan glanced at her, not surprised, not impatient, just listening the way he always had, as if every word mattered more than the situation pressing in around them. "The failsafe within me," she continued, her hand resting lightly against her chest where the glow pulsed steadily. "It does not only respond to destruction, it responds to intent, to the final decision made when no other options remain." Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly, understanding forming not from explanation but from instinct. "Meaning?" he asked. She met his gaze fully, no hesitation left between them. "If you choose to end my life to save your world, the signal activates. But if you choose to protect me even when it guarantees your own loss." She paused, the light beneath her chest brightening, just slightly. "The signal does not trigger. It dissolves." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something heavier than fear, heavier than survival, and Ethan let out a slow breath, not because he needed time to think, but because the answer had already been there long before the question was asked. Above them, the hum intensified, the scanning pulses now overlapping completely, sealing the ravine in a net of certainty that left no path forward, no angle left unobserved. And for the first time since this began, there was no movement Ethan could make that would not be seen. "So this is it," he said quietly, not as defeat, but as recognition. She nodded once, her expression calm, almost peaceful in a way that did not belong on a battlefield. "Yes, this is the moment your kind was never meant to reach." Ethan looked up at the narrow strip of sky again, the light shifting as the scan prepared to sweep down into the ravine itself. And then he looked back at her, not at the glow, not at the signal, but at her, the person he had chosen to protect from the very beginning. "You said it responds to intent," he said, his voice steady despite everything closing in around them. She nodded, understanding what he was asking before he finished. "Then I guess it is time we make that clear," he said. She held his gaze, something quiet and profound settling between them, something that did not need words anymore. And for the first time since they met, she did not see him as unpredictable or illogical or even human in the limited way she once understood the term. She saw him as something far more dangerous to the universe than any weapon. She saw him as someone who would choose compassion even when the cost was everything. Above them, the scan began to descend, the light tightening, focusing, and Ethan did not reach for his weapon, did not step back, did not change his position. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, between her and the sky, not as a shield, not as a strategy, but as a choice. And as the light touched the edge of the ravine, something within her chest responded, not with alarm, not with activation, but with a quiet, steady resonance that felt less like a signal and more like a decision being made. The final test is not whether you can survive, but whether you can choose who survives. The light descended into the ravine with a precision that left no space for doubt, no room for error, a perfect lattice of scanning energy tightening around them as Ethan Cole stood unmoving, his body steady despite the failing systems in his suit, despite the quiet warnings fading into silence one by one until even the numbers no longer mattered. The air itself felt different now, not cold, not sharp, but suspended, as if the world had paused to witness the outcome of a decision that could not be reversed. Behind him, she did not step away, did not retreat, her presence anchored not by fear but by something deeper, something that had grown between them in the space of choices made without expectation. The glow beneath her chest intensified, not violently, not erratically, but with a calm, deliberate rhythm that no longer resembled a warning signal, but something closer to recognition. "They are observing," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet clarity that had replaced all uncertainty. "Not just my state, but yours." Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed upward as the scanning light hovered just above him, close enough that his visor dimmed automatically, filtering the brightness into something bearable, though the meaning behind it required no translation. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low but certain. "Figured they would want to see how this ends." The light shifted slightly, narrowing, focusing not on her, but on him, tracing his outline with an exactness that suggested analysis rather than aggression, evaluation rather than execution. She stepped forward then, just enough that she stood beside him rather than behind, her shoulder nearly touching his, not as someone being protected, but as someone sharing the weight of the moment. "You understand what happens now," she said, not as a warning, but as acknowledgement. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate. "Yeah, I do." The glow within her chest pulsed again, stronger this time, and for a brief moment the light around them seemed to respond, not dimming, not intensifying, but stabilizing, as if two systems that had once been in opposition were now communicating in a language neither fully understood. "There is still a path," she said quietly, her gaze forward, not on the light, but on the horizon beyond it. "You can still choose to end this, to ensure your world remains safe." Ethan let out a slow breath, not because the choice was difficult, but because it had never been a choice at all. "I already did," he said simply. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of something that could not be measured, something that existed beyond logic, beyond survival. And for the first time since the scanning began, the light did not press closer, did not tighten its hold. Instead, it paused. Above them, the hum shifted, not louder, not sharper, but different, as if whatever intelligence guided it had reached a conclusion that did not require force. She turned her head slightly, looking at him not as a variable, not as a factor in an equation, but as something entirely new, something her kind had never accounted for. "Your species is not defined by efficiency," she said softly. "You are defined by what you refuse to abandon." Ethan gave a faint nod, the smallest hint of something human breaking through the weight of the moment. "Yeah, we are stubborn like that." The light responded again, but this time it did not descend further, did not close in. It expanded, subtly at first, then more clearly, pulling back from the ravine, lifting upward as the scanning pattern dissolved into something less rigid, less controlled. The pressure in the air eased, the tension that had held everything in place beginning to fade, and Ethan remained where he was, not moving, not reacting, because some moments were not meant to be interrupted. Beside him, the glow in her chest shifted once more, no longer pulsing like a signal waiting to be sent, but stabilizing into something constant, something quiet. The failsafe, she began, her voice almost a whisper. Now, it is no longer active. Ethan glanced at her, just briefly, as if confirming what he already knew without needing proof. Above them, the light continued to retreat, the hum fading into the distance, not in defeat, not in retreat, but in acceptance. And as the sky returned to its empty stillness, Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling into something quieter, something that did not need explanation. He had not saved the world by force, or by strategy, or by power. He had done it by standing still when everything told him to act, by choosing not to destroy what he did not understand. And in that choice, something far greater than survival had been decided. Sometimes the victory no one sees is the one that changes everything. The sky above the ravine had returned to stillness, the scanning light gone as if it had never existed, leaving behind only the pale glow of distant stars barely visible through the thin atmosphere, while Ethan Cole stood where he had made his choice, his body finally allowing the tension to settle into something quieter, something heavier, as the last of his suit systems dimmed to near silence. The cold returned in full now, no longer held back by urgency or adrenaline, pressing through the weakened layers of his gear. But he did not move right away, because movement was no longer necessary, not in the way it had been before. Beside him, she remained still as well, her posture no longer guarded, no longer uncertain, the glow beneath her chest steady and calm, no longer pulsing with purpose but existing as something constant, something that belonged to her again rather than the system that had once defined her. "It is over," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet finality that did not need confirmation. Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it fade into the cold air before answering. "Yeah, looks like it." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense but reflective, filled with everything that had led to this point and everything that would follow. She turned to him then, her gaze steady, searching not for explanation but for understanding. "Your world remains because of a decision that defies logic," she said, not as judgment, but as realization. Ethan gave a faint shrug, the motion slower now, heavier. Would not be the first time. She studied him more closely, as if seeing him clearly for the first time without the lens of survival or classification. "You accepted loss as a possibility," she said. Without hesitation, Ethan glanced down briefly at his suit, at the fading indicators that no longer tried to warn him, then back at her. "That is part of the job." She shook her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in correction. "No, that is part of who you are." The words settled between them, quiet but undeniable, and Ethan did not argue, because some things did not need to be defended. The wind shifted again, lighter now, carrying none of the tension it had before, just the natural movement of a world that no longer watched them as targets. She took a step forward, closing the small distance between them, not out of necessity, but intention. "My people created the failsafe because they believed no species could be trusted when faced with extinction," she said, her voice steady. "They believed that survival would always outweigh compassion." Ethan listened without interruption, his expression calm, grounded in something that did not need validation. "You proved that assumption wrong," she continued, "not by strength, but by restraint." Ethan let out a quiet breath, something almost like a laugh, but softer. "Funny way to win a war." She held his gaze, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that resembled warmth, not in the human sense, but in something just as real. "It was never a war," she said. "It was a test." The words lingered in the air, and Ethan considered them for a moment, not as a revelation, but as something that fit too well to ignore. "Yeah," he said finally, "feels about right." His legs shifted slightly, the strain finally catching up as his body reminded him of its limits, and he leaned back against the rock for support, not collapsing, not failing, just adjusting to reality the same way he had adjusted to everything else. She noticed immediately, her gaze flicking briefly to his suit, to the dim systems, to the signs of a body that had given everything it could without asking for anything in return. You are reaching your limit, she said quietly. Ethan gave a small nod. No denial. No attempt to hide it. Yeah. Happens. She stepped closer again, her hand lifting slightly before pausing, not out of hesitation, but respect, as if she understood that some boundaries were not about distance, but about choice. Your survival probability is decreasing rapidly, she said, though the words no longer carried the same meaning they once had. Ethan met her gaze, steady as ever. Would not be the first time either. She held that look for a moment longer, then lowered her hand, not because she could not help, but because she understood that what mattered now was not fixing the outcome, but honoring the choice that led to it. Above them, the sky remained quiet, the silence no longer filled with threat, but with possibility, and as Ethan closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, the weight of everything that had happened settled into something simple, something human. He had not been a hero, not in the way stories would tell it, not in the way victories were usually measured. He had simply refused to abandon someone who needed him, and somehow, that had been enough. The cost of a choice is not measured by what you lose, but by what you refuse to regret. The cold pressed deeper into Ethan Cole's bones as the last traces of power in his suit faded into silence, the faint glow of his interface disappearing one element at a time until there was nothing left between him and the world but fabric, breath, and will, and he let his head rest lightly against the rock behind him, eyes half open, not from weakness but from the quiet acceptance of a body that had given everything it could. The ravine remained still, the sky above empty now, no longer watching, no longer measuring, and for the first time since this began, there was no urgency left to outrun, no signal left to stop, just the aftermath of a decision that had already changed more than either of them could see. Beside him, she remained standing for a moment longer, her gaze fixed on him not with confusion or calculation, but with something deeper, something that had formed slowly across every moment they had shared. And when she finally moved, it was not with hesitation, but with purpose. She lowered herself beside him, close enough that the faint warmth of her presence met the cold that had begun to settle into him. And though her kind did not share warmth in the way humans did, there was something else there, something quieter, something that did not rely on temperature to be felt. Your body is failing, she said softly, not as a statement of inevitability, but as something she refused to accept without understanding. Ethan let out a slow breath, watching it fade into the air as he glanced toward her, his expression calm, almost distant in the way people became when they had already made peace with something others had not yet faced. Yeah, it does that sometimes. She studied him, searching for something that would explain why he spoke of his own condition without fear, without urgency, and finding nothing that matched the framework she had known. You speak as if this outcome does not matter, she said. Ethan gave a faint shake of his head. The movement small but certain. It matters, just not in the way you think. She fell silent at that, her gaze lowering briefly before returning to him, and for the first time since she had known of his existence, she reached out without hesitation, her hand resting lightly against his arm, not to assess, not to measure, but to connect. The glow beneath her chest responded immediately, softening, spreading just enough to reflect across his suit, across his skin, as if whatever energy remained within her was no longer bound by its original purpose. There may still be a way, she said quietly, her voice carrying a fragile thread of something new, something that had not existed when they first met. The failsafe is gone, but the core within me still holds energy, still holds function. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in refusal, but in consideration, feeling the weight of her words, the possibility they carried, and the cost they implied. What kind of function? He asked, his voice steady despite the slowing rhythm of his breath. She hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of what she was about to offer. It was designed to judge, but it can also restore, to stabilize biological systems temporarily, at a cost. Ethan opened his eyes again, meeting her gaze, understanding forming not from explanation, but from the tone beneath her words. Your cost. She did not look away, did not soften the truth. Yes, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had led to this moment, every decision, every step, every choice that had brought them here. and Ethan let out a slow breath, not because he needed time, but because he respected what she was offering. You already did enough, he said quietly. Her hand tightened slightly against his arm, not in force, but in resolve. That is not how your kind measures enough. Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Something human, something warm despite the cold pressing in around them. No, it is not. She leaned closer then, the glow from her chest brightening just enough to illuminate the space between them. And for a moment the ravine felt less like a place of endings and more like something else, something undefined, something still in motion. You showed me what your kind is capable of, she said softly, her voice no longer distant, no longer analytical, but present. Now allow me to show you what mine can choose to become. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, seeing not a weapon, not a failsafe, but a person standing at the edge of her own choice. And he understood then that this was not about survival, not anymore. It was about something else entirely. And as the faint light from her chest began to shift, responding not to threat, not to protocol, but to intention, the air around them seemed to hold its breath once more, not in anticipation of an ending, but of what might come after. The rarest thing in the universe is not power, it is the choice to give it away. The faint light beneath her chest began to shift, no longer pulsing like a signal or stabilizing like a system, but unfolding, expanding in a quiet, deliberate way that felt less like activation and more like release as she moved closer to Ethan Cole, her hand steady against his arm, while the glow spread softly across his suit, across his skin, illuminating the space between them with a warmth that did not belong to temperature but to intention. Ethan watched it without fear, without resistance, his breathing slow, his body still, not because he could not move, but because he understood what she was choosing before she finished choosing it. This will change my core, she said quietly, her voice calm, grounded. The function that once judged will no longer exist as it was. Ethan gave a faint nod, his gaze steady on hers. Yeah, I figured. The light grew stronger, but not blinding, not overwhelming, just enough to soften the edges of the cold around them as it flowed from her chest outward, wrapping gently around his form, responding not to damage, not to injury, but to the simple fact that he was still there, still breathing, still choosing. Your physiology is different, she continued, her voice quieter now, as if speaking required more focus. The process will not be precise, but it will be enough. Ethan let out a slow breath, something almost like a laugh under the weight of everything. Enough has been working so far. Her expression shifted then, something almost like understanding deepening into something else, something closer to connection, and she leaned in just slightly, closing the distance not out of necessity, but meaning. The glow intensified again, and this time Ethan felt it, not as heat, not as force, but as something moving through him, subtle at first, then clearer, like a system. Reconnecting in places that had gone quiet, restoring balance where there had been none, not perfect, not complete, but real. His breath steadied, the strain in his chest easing just enough to notice, the weight pressing against his body lifting slightly, as if the world had decided not to pull so hard anymore. He closed his eyes briefly, not from exhaustion, but from the simple act of feeling something return. It is working, she said softly, though her voice carried a faint strain now, the cost beginning to show not in pain, but in the dimming of the glow that had once defined her presence. Ethan opened his eyes again, meeting her gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because words were not needed to understand what was being given and what was being lost. You do not have to do this, he said quietly, not as refusal, but as acknowledgement. She shook her head slightly, her hand remaining steady against him despite the weakening light. This is not obligation. This is choice. The glow flickered once, then steadied again at a lower intensity, no longer radiating outward but concentrating, focusing, completing what it had begun. Ethan felt the last of it settle, not as power, not as strength, but as stability. The difference between fading and continuing, the silence, returned after that, softer now, calmer, and she slowly pulled her hand back, the light beneath her chest no longer bright, no longer pulsing, but present in a quieter form, something altered, something new. She looked down briefly, as if sensing the change within herself, then back at him, her expression no longer defined by purpose or function, but by something far more uncertain and far more human. "It is done," she said. Ethan took a slow breath, deeper than before, steadier, and nodded. "Once, yeah, it is." She remained still for a moment longer, then asked the question that had not existed until now. "What happens to me now?" Ethan considered that, not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as someone who had just witnessed something the universe was not designed to explain, and when he answered, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that had guided every step he had taken. "Now," he said softly, "now you get to decide." He was not chosen to save the stars. He simply refused to forget what hearts are for. The ravine no longer felt like a place of endings as the silence settled into something deeper, something vast and quiet beneath the pale stretch of sky above. And Ethan Cole stood slowly, his body no longer fighting itself with every breath. The weight that had once pulled him down now replaced with something steadier, something earned rather than given. Beside him, she remained still for a moment longer. Her gaze lifted toward the open sky, as if seeing it for the first time, without filters, without purpose, without the invisible lines that had once defined her existence. The glow beneath her chest was no longer a signal, no longer a system waiting to judge or activate. It was softer now, almost human in its rhythm, imperfect, unmeasured, alive in a way that did not need explanation. "I can feel it," she said quietly, her voice carrying something new, something unstructured. "There is no directive, no function guiding me." Ethan nodded slightly, stepping forward just enough to stand beside her rather than ahead of her, no longer leading, no longer shielding, just present. "Yeah," he said, his tone calm, almost familiar now. "That is what freedom feels like." She turned her head toward him, studying his expression not for answers, but for confirmation, and for the first time there was no hesitation in her gaze, no search for logic or outcome, only recognition. "It is uncertain," she said. Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "Yeah, that is part of the deal." The wind moved gently through the ravine now, no longer harsh, no longer carrying the weight of something hunting them, just a natural current, across a world that had moved on from the moment that could have ended everything. She looked back toward the horizon, her posture shifting slightly, not from weakness, but from the awareness that there was no longer a path defined for her, no role waiting to be fulfilled. "My people will not recognize what I have become," she said, not with fear, but with understanding. Ethan considered that for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That happens more than you would think." She glanced at him again, something almost curious in her expression. "And what do your people do when they no longer recognize who they are?" Ethan looked out across the broken terrain, the scattered formations, the distant silence that stretched far beyond anything they could see, and when he answered, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that had guided him from the beginning. "We figure it out. One step at a time." She absorbed that, not as instruction, but as possibility, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them no longer defined by survival or necessity, but by something far simpler, choice. Above them, the sky remained still, no ships, no signals, no watchers left to measure or judge. Just the vast quiet of a universe that had been reminded, in the smallest possible way, that power was not its only language. She took a step forward then, not away from him, but into the open, into the unknown that waited beyond the ravine. And for a brief moment she paused, looking back at him, not as a soldier, not as a savior, but as the one who had changed everything without ever trying to. "Ethan," she said softly, his name no longer foreign, no longer distant. "Your kind does not conquer." The stars. Ethan met her gaze, a faint, almost imperceptible smile forming at the edge of something deeper, something quieter. "No," he said. She held his gaze for one more second, the faint light within her reflecting something new, something no longer bound by origin or design. "You remind them what they are for." The wind moved again, carrying her words into the open air as she turned and continued forward, her steps unmeasured, uncalculated, and for the first time truly her own. Ethan watched her go, not with regret, not with doubt, just with the quiet understanding that some things were never meant to be held, only protected long enough to become something more. He remained there for a moment longer, the cold no longer biting, the silence no longer heavy. And as he finally turned to follow his own path, there was no victory to claim, no story to tell, just a simple truth that would never make it into any report or record. He had not been a hero. He had simply been human. And somehow, that had been enough.